What happens when one of music's most legendary voices sits down for what should be a celebration of her career, only to have the conversation take a sharp turn into territory she never agreed to discuss? The queen of funk, Chaka Khan, found herself in the middle of a television moment that nobody saw coming, and what unfolded became one of the most talked about interviews in morning show history. Before we get into what happened, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below with your thoughts on how interviews like this should be handled. Now let's get into it. The Today Show set was buzzing with the usual morning energy as Chaka Khan settled into her seat across from the host. This was supposed to be a straightforward interview, the kind she had done hundreds of times before. The initial plan was simple: talk about her upcoming tours, reflect on her 5-decade career, maybe share a few stories about her greatest hits. The audience was ready for inspiration, for music history, for that signature Chaka Khan charisma that had made her an icon. The interview started smoothly enough. The host opened with a warm welcome, praising her contributions to music and the lasting impact of songs like I'm Every Woman and Ain't Nobody. Chaka smiled, nodded graciously, and began sharing anecdotes about her early days in the industry. She talked about the evolution of funk and soul, about the incredible musicians she had worked with over the years, and about the joy of still being able to perform for audiences around the world. But then, about 5 minutes in, the tone shifted. The host leaned forward slightly, adopting what seemed like a more serious posture, and said, "You know, Chaka, I think a lot of people admire not just your music, but your journey. You've been very open about some of your struggles in the past. Can we talk about your battle with addiction and how that shaped who you are today?" There was a pause, a brief moment where you could almost feel the temperature in the studio change. Chaka's expression, which had been open and engaged, became more guarded. She straightened in her chair and replied, "Well, that's not really what we're here to discuss today. I thought we were focusing on the tour and the music." The host pressed on, not picking up on the clear boundary being set, or perhaps choosing to ignore it. "I understand, but I think your story of recovery is so powerful. So many people struggle with similar issues. And hearing from someone who's overcome it, someone of your stature, that's really meaningful. When you look back at that period of your life, what would you say to your younger self?" Chaka's jaw tightened. Her voice remained steady, but there was an edge to it now. "I appreciate that you think it's important, but I've talked about that part of my life extensively in other forums. I wrote about it in my book. I've done interviews specifically about recovery. This interview was scheduled to be about my music and my tour. That's what I prepared for. That's what I agreed to." The host seemed taken aback by the directness, but continued, Of course. I just think, when you're a public figure of your caliber, people want to know the whole person. They want to understand the journey, not just the destination. Your fans care about you, not just your music." "My fans," Chaka said, her tone now unmistakably firm, "support me because of my music. That's the relationship we have, and while I'm grateful for their care and concern, I'm also allowed to have boundaries about what I discuss and when. I'm here as a professional to talk about professional matters." There was an uncomfortable silence. The production crew behind the cameras exchanged glances. The host, perhaps realizing the interview was veering off course, attempted to pivot. "Okay, let's talk about the tour then. But before we do, I'm curious, because you mentioned boundaries. Do you think artists today have it easier or harder when it comes to maintaining privacy? I mean, with social media and everything." It was a transition, but not a clean one. Chaka recognized it for what it was, an attempt to make the previous line of questioning seem relevant by connecting it to a broader conversation. She wasn't buying it. "I think that's still dancing around the same topic. You're trying to get me to talk about personal struggles by framing it as a general question about the industry. I'm not doing that today." The host's smile became more strained. "I'm just trying to have a real conversation. Chaka, our viewers appreciate authenticity. They appreciate when public figures don't just come on and give the same canned responses about their latest project. They want connection. Connection doesn't mean I have to give you access to every part of my life." Chaka shot back. "Authenticity doesn't mean I can't have boundaries. I've been doing this long enough to know the difference between a conversation and an interrogation. And right now, this feels like you're trying to get me to go somewhere I explicitly said I wouldn't go." The energy on set was now undeniably tense. Camera operators kept filming. Producers were likely scrambling in the control room, and the studio audience sat in stunned silence. This was not the lighthearted morning television moment anyone had expected. The host, perhaps feeling defensive, or maybe just committed to the line of questioning, pushed forward. "I'm not interrogating you, Chaka. I'm asking questions that I think are relevant to understanding who you are as an artist and as a person. Great artists draw from their experiences, from their pain as well as their joy. Isn't that true?" "Of course it's true," Chaka replied, "but that doesn't mean I owe anyone a detailed account of my pain on demand. I put my experiences into my music. That's where I've chosen to process and share those parts of my life. If you want to understand my journey, listen to my albums, read my book, but don't sit here and tell me that respecting my boundaries is somehow being inauthentic." The host's expression hardened slightly. I think you're being a bit defensive. I'm just doing my job, asking questions that viewers want answered. And I'm doing my job, Chaka said, her voice rising just slightly, which is to promote my tour and discuss my music, which is what this interview was supposed to be about. If your viewers want to know about my recovery journey, there are plenty of resources available where I've discussed that at length. In contexts where I chose to have those conversations, this is not one of those contexts. So you're saying there are some topics that are just off limits? The host asked, with a tone that suggested this was somehow unreasonable. I'm saying that I have the right to determine what I discuss in any given interview, Chaka responded. That's not being difficult. That's not being defensive. That's being a professional who understands that not every platform and not every moment is appropriate for every conversation. And I'm saying that when someone tells you they don't want to discuss something, the appropriate response is to respect that, not to keep pushing. The host sat back, clearly frustrated. Well, this is live television. Chaka, things don't always go exactly according to plan. Sometimes the conversation takes us in unexpected directions. There's a difference between an unexpected direction and deliberately ignoring what someone has told you, Chaka said. I told you, clearly and directly, that I didn't want to discuss my past struggles today. You've now brought it up multiple times in different ways. That's not the conversation taking an unexpected turn. That's you deciding that what you want to talk about is more important than what I'm comfortable discussing. The studio fell silent again. The host seemed to be weighing options, perhaps considering whether to finally pivot to safer territory or to continue defending the approach. The audience waited. Chaka sat perfectly still, her expression calm but unyielding. This was a woman who had been in the music industry for decades, who had navigated far more difficult situations than an uncomfortable television interview. She was not going to be pushed into a corner. The host finally broke the silence, but instead of moving on, doubled down. You know, I have to say, I find it interesting that you're so resistant to talking about something that you yourself have been public about in the past. It's not like I'm asking you to reveal some deep secret. You've written about it, you've spoken about it before. So why is it suddenly off limits now? Chaka's eyes narrowed. Because I get to decide when and where I talk about my personal life. That's called agency. That's called having control over my own narrative. Just because I've been open about something in the past doesn't mean I've given blanket permission for every interviewer to bring it up whenever they feel like it. Context matters. Consent matters. And I did not consent to this line of questioning today. But don't you think that's a little bit contradictory? The host challenged. You can't be selectively public about things. Once you put something out there, it becomes part of your public story. People are going to ask about it. People can ask about whatever they want, Chaka said, her voice steady but forceful. And I can choose not to answer. That's how boundaries work. What I'm objecting to here is not just the questions, but your insistence on continuing to ask them after I've made it clear I'm not interested in discussing this topic today. You're acting like I'm being unreasonable for having limits on what I'm willing to share in this particular moment. On this particular show, the host's face flushed slightly. I'm just trying to do a thorough interview. I'm trying to give viewers something meaningful, not just a puff piece about tour dates and album sales. A puff piece, Chaka repeated, her tone sharp. So talking about my music, the thing I've dedicated my entire life to, the thing I'm actually here to promote, that's a puff piece to you. That's not meaningful. My 5 decades in the music industry, the evolution of funk and soul, the collaborations I've been part of, the new generation of artists I'm working with on this tour, none of that is meaningful enough for you. The host shifted uncomfortably. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Chaka pressed, because it sounds to me like you're saying that the only way this interview has value is if I talk about my personal struggles, as if my professional accomplishments aren't enough, as if my music isn't enough, as if I'm not enough unless I'm being vulnerable in the way you want me to be vulnerable. I think you're reading too much into this, the host said defensively. I'm just trying to connect with you on a human level. No, Chaka said firmly, you're trying to get a moment. You're trying to get me to cry, or get emotional, or share something deeply personal so you can have a clip that goes viral. That's what this is about. And I'm telling you right now, that's not happening. I didn't come here to be exploited for ratings. The accusation hung in the air like a thundercloud. The host's expression shifted from defensive to offended. That's completely unfair. I resent the implication that I'm trying to exploit you. I'm a journalist. I ask tough questions. That's my job. Tough questions about what Chaka challenged, about my music, about my creative process, about the state of the industry. Those would be tough questions. Asking me to rehash painful, personal experiences that I've already processed and moved past. That's not tough journalism. That's tabloid tactics dressed up as depths. I disagree, the host said, voice rising slightly. I think exploring the personal experiences that shape an artist's work is absolutely legitimate journalism. Some of the best interviews ever conducted have been ones where artists opened up about their struggles. When they chose to, Chaka emphasized. when they felt safe and ready and in control of that conversation. Not when they were ambushed on live television after being told the interview would be about something else entirely. That's the difference you don't seem to understand. It's not about whether those conversations have value. It's about consent and respect and honoring what someone has agreed to. The host leaned forward, clearly frustrated. So what? We're just supposed to avoid anything remotely personal? Just stick to the script and pretend like you're not a real person with a real story. There's a massive space between avoiding anything personal and bulldozing through someone's clearly stated boundaries. Chaka replied. You could have asked me about what inspires me musically. You could have asked about the personal connections I have to certain songs. You could have asked about the emotional experience of performing for audiences after all these years. Those are personal questions that relate to my artistry. Instead, you went straight for the trauma, and when I said no, you kept pushing. The host took a breath, seeming to collect themselves. Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Can we just reset and talk about the tour? But the damage was done, and Chaka knew it. You want to reset now? After you've spent the last 10 minutes arguing with me about why I should give you what you want. After you've essentially told me that my music isn't interesting enough to carry an interview. No, I don't think we can just reset. I never said your music isn't interesting. The host protested. You called discussing it a puff piece. Chaka reminded them, you made it very clear that you think this interview only has value if we dig into my personal pain. That tells me everything I need to know about how you view me and my work. I'm not a serious artist to you. I'm just someone whose trauma might make for good television. The host's mouth opened as if to argue, then closed again. There was a long pause. Finally they said, I think you're being overly sensitive about this. It was the wrong thing to say. Chaka's expression went from frustrated to cold. Overly sensitive. There it is. A woman, especially a black woman, sets a boundary and suddenly she's being overly sensitive. She's being difficult. She's not being a team player. I've heard that my entire career. I've heard it from record executives who wanted to control my image. I've heard it from producers who wanted me to compromise my artistic vision. And now I'm hearing it from you because I won't let you turn this interview into something I never agreed to. That's not fair, the host said. I'm not. This isn't about race or gender. This is about you not being willing to have an honest conversation. It absolutely is about race and gender, Chaka said, her voice rising with conviction. Because, I guarantee you wouldn't be pushing this hard with a white male artist. I guarantee you wouldn't call him overly sensitive for having boundaries. I guarantee you would respect his professional authority and move on when he said he didn't want to discuss something. But because I'm a black woman, you think you can push and prod and then dismiss my objections as me being difficult. The host looked genuinely taken aback. That's not. I would ask the same questions of anyone. But would you keep asking after they said no? Chaka challenged. Would you argue with them about it? Would you tell them they're being contradictory, or defensive, or overly sensitive? Or would you respect their boundary and move forward with the interview they actually agreed to? The host had no answer. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and heavy. Camera operators continued filming, capturing every second of what had become a masterclass in someone refusing to be pushed around. The studio audience watched in fascination and discomfort, unsure whether to be impressed by Chaka's backbone or concerned about the escalating tension. Finally, the host attempted another approach. Chaka, I apologize if I've offended you. That was never my intention. Can we please just continue with the interview and talk about your tours? But Chaka was done. She could hear in the apology, the way it was phrased as sorry if you were offended, rather than sorry for what I did. She had been in this industry too long to accept that kind of non-apology. Your intention doesn't really matter at this point, she said quietly. What matters is your impact. And the impact of this interview has been to make me feel disrespected, unheard, and reduced to nothing more than my past struggles. So no, I don't think we can just move on and pretend this didn't happen. What are you saying? The host asked, a note of worry creeping into their voice. I'm saying that I don't see any point in continuing this, Chaka replied. I came here in good faith to talk about my music and my tours. Instead, I've spent the entire time defending my right to have boundaries. That's not an interview. That's an argument, and I don't need to sit here and argue with you about why I deserve basic respect. The host's eyes widened. Wait, you're not thinking of leaving, are you? We still have half the segment left. Chaka stood up slowly, deliberately, maintaining her composure even as the decision crystallized in her mind. I am leaving. Because staying here and continuing this conversation would be telling myself that it's okay for people to treat me this way. And it's not okay. It never has been, and it never will be. Chaka, please, the host said, standing as well, genuine panic starting to show through. Let's not be hasty about this. We can talk about whatever you want. Just sit back down and we'll focus entirely on the tour. I promise. Your promises don't mean much at this point, Chaka said, removing her microphone. You already promised that this would be about my music. You already had the talking points from my team about what this interview would cover. And you ignored all of that because you thought you knew better. You thought you could manipulate the conversation to where you wanted it to go, regardless of what I wanted or what we had agreed upon. The host glanced nervously at the cameras, very aware that all of this was being broadcast live. Can we please just take a moment? Maybe we can go to commercial and talk this through. There's nothing to talk through, Chaka said firmly. This isn't a negotiation. I'm not interested in giving you a commercial break to regroup and figure out how to salvage this. The time to show me respect was before the interview started, when you actually read the agreements about what would be discussed. The time to show me respect was the first time I said I didn't want to talk about something. You had multiple opportunities to do the right thing, and you chose not to take any of them. A producer rushed onto the set, clearly trying to contain the situation. They approached Chaka with placating gestures. Miss Khan, please, if we could just take a quick break and discuss this. Chaka turned to the producer with a look that was both weary and resolute. I appreciate that you have a show to run, but I am not obligated to stay in a situation where I'm being disrespected, just because it's inconvenient for your production schedule. This should have been handled before we went live. Your host should have been briefed properly. Someone dropped the ball here, and it's not my responsibility to fix it by subjecting myself to more of this. The host interjected, voice strained. I was briefed. I knew what we were supposed to talk about, but I'm also supposed to follow the conversation where it naturally goes, to ask follow-up questions, to dig deeper. That's what good interviewers do. Good interviewers also know how to read a room, Chaka countered. They know how to recognize when they've crossed a line. They know the difference between digging deeper and disregarding someone's boundaries. You keep talking about what you're supposed to do, but what about what I'm supposed to do? Am I just supposed to sit here and let you interrogate me about whatever you want, regardless of how it makes me feel? I wasn't interrogating you, the host insisted, but their voice lacked conviction. Now, you were, Chaka said simply, and even if you don't see it that way, even if you genuinely think you were just doing your job, the fact remains that I told you I was uncomfortable, and you kept going. That's all that matters. My comfort, my consent, those things should matter more than your journalistic vision or your idea of what makes good television. The producer tried again. What if we restart the segment? Fresh start, new questions, completely focused on the tours and the music. Chaka shook her head. That's not going to fix this. The damage is done. I've already told you how I feel. And it's clear that my feelings are being treated as obstacles to overcome rather than valid responses that deserve respect. Starting over doesn't change the fundamental problem here, which is that you brought me on this show under false pretenses and then tried to pressure me into giving you something I never agreed to give. The host's frustration was showing more clearly now. False pretenses is a strong accusation. We had every intention of talking about your music. After you got what you really wanted, Chaka said, that's the formula, isn't it? Ask the uncomfortable personal questions first. Get the emotional moment you're looking for, and then wrap it up with some softball questions about upcoming projects so it looks like you covered everything. I've seen it 1,000 times. I've been subjected to it more times than I can count, and I'm done with it. So what? You're just going to walk off in the middle of a live broadcast? The host asked, and there was an edge of accusation in the question, as if Chaka was the one being unprofessional. Yes, Chaka said without hesitation, because sometimes walking away is the most professional thing you can do. It's me standing up for myself. It's me making it clear that there are consequences when you treat people poorly. And maybe, just maybe, it will make someone think twice before they try to pull this with the next artist who sits in this chair. The host made one last attempt. Chaka, please. I'm asking you, as a professional to a professional, please sit back down. We'll do this your way. Complete control over the topics. Just please don't walk off. Chaka studied the host for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was surprisingly gentle. You're asking me as a professional to a professional. But you haven't been treating me as a professional. You've been treating me as content, as a means to an end, as someone whose job is to give you what you want for your show. But that's not how this works. I'm not here to serve your agenda. I'm here to promote my work on terms that I'm comfortable with. And since you've made it clear that my comfort is not a priority for you, I'm making my comfort a priority for myself by leaving. With that, she handed her microphone to the stunned producer and began walking toward the exit. The host called after her, voice cracking slightly. Chaka, wait, just, please. Can we talk about this? Chaka paused and turned back. We just did talk about it. For the last 15 minutes, we talked about it. The problem is, you didn't like what I had to say. You wanted me to back down, to give in, to prioritize your vision over my boundaries. And I won't do that. Not for you, not for this show, not for anyone. This is going to be everywhere, the host said quietly. Good, Chaka said. Maybe it should be. Maybe people need to see what it looks like when someone refuses to be bulldozed. Maybe other artists will see this and feel empowered to set their own boundaries. If me walking off this show accomplishes any of that, then it's worth whatever controversy comes from it. The host finally called out one more time. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry if I pushed too hard. Just please, don't leave like this. Chaka stopped at the edge of the set, but didn't turn around. I appreciate the apology, but sorry doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't change the fact that you kept pushing after I asked you to stop. Learn from this. Do better next time. But I'm still leaving. And with that, she walked off the set, leaving behind a stunned host, a frantic production team, and a moment of television that would be analyzed and discussed for days to come. The cameras kept rolling, capturing the empty chair where Chaka had been sitting, the host's stunned expression, the uncomfortable silence that filled the studio. This was not how morning television was supposed to go. This was something raw and real and uncomfortable. A collision between the expectations of entertainment television and the dignity of an artist who refused to compromise herself for the sake of a show. Chaka Khan had made her point. She had drawn her line, and she had walked away with her head held high. A powerful reminder that respect is not negotiable and boundaries are not suggestions. If you made it this far, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below. What do you think? Should artists be expected to answer personal questions in interviews, or do they have the right to keep certain topics off limits? Let me know your thoughts.